Tales from the Rails. Discovering the Stockton and Darlington Railway. The railway that got the world on track.
Hello and welcome to our 9th Tales from the Rails, our monthly podcast on the Stockton and Darlington Railway, the railway that was the start of our modern railway network. Today we're going to get ourselves an education. My name is Caroline Hardy.
And my name is Archie Mackay.
I'm an archaeologist and the editor and a trustee for the charity The Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway.
And I'm managing editor of South West Durham News, a small independent publisher of 4 community newspapers, including the Shildon and District Town Crier, produced right here in the cradle of the railways.
So this week on Tales from the Rails, we're talking about education. Who had an education or skills in the Stockton and Darlington Railway? Who didn't? And how did senior S&DR staff decide to improve educational standards amongst its workers? And did the workers appreciate this? We're joined this month by 2 people who can tell us all about this. Dave Reynolds is the chair for Shildon's Railway Institute, and Jane Hackworth-Young is the great-great-granddaughter of Timothy and Jane Hackworth. So it'll come as no surprise to you that our star of the S&DR this month is Timothy Hackworth.
We'll also be letting you know about the latest news, so plug in your headphones and enjoy the ride on the railway that got the world on track.
So when the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened in 1825, there was no compulsory education. That didn't appear until 1880. At Etherley Colliery, when the railway was opened, there were only 2 men who could write their own names. And Robert Young, when writing his book on Timothy Hackworth and the locomotive, described the railway workers of New Shildon as, in the main, rough, unskilled, and ignorant.
Education cost money, although there were charities and religious institutions that provided education, often in return for a modest fee. But generally, you needed to have means to pay for an education. The majority of railway workers didn't have the means.
But that didn't mean they were unskilled. They might learn their profession through experience or an apprenticeship, but they still might not be able to read and write. When Jem Stevenson, Locomotion No. 1's first regular driver, went to collect his wages, he couldn't sign his name, but left a cross instead. Unlike his younger brother George, he hadn't gone to evening classes to learn the skills of reading and writing, and neither of them had parents who could afford to send them to school. But if you did your apprenticeship under Timothy Hackworth at New Shildon, you were almost guaranteed a job anywhere in the world. Such was the reputation for the skills of mechanics created there.
Shildon is important in this story of education. New Shildon, created by the Stockton and Darlington Railway, as opposed to Old Shildon up the road, although they're now really just one settlement, was where the railway workers congregated in the largest numbers because it was here that the locomotive works were located. It should be no surprise then that it is also home to the world's first Railway Institute.
Joining us today is Dave Reynolds. You know Dave already because he's a well-educated man with many talents, and as such is the composer and musician behind our theme tune. But he's also the chair of the Shildon Railway Institute and a director of the Shildon Heritage Alliance, a volunteer organisation championing the town's industrial and cultural heritage. He also works full-time and has kindly taken time off work today to share his vast knowledge about the Railway Institute. Hello, Dave.
Hello, Caroline. Hi, Archie. Very nice to be here, and all the more so given that you've brought along some milk chocolate trains to enjoy.
I can highly recommend them. They're very addictive.
Hello, Dave. We're also joined today by Jane Hackworth-Young. Jane is the great-great-granddaughter of Timothy Hackworth, who was the Stockton and Darlington Railway's resident engineer and locomotive superintendent from 1825, and his wife, Jane Hackworth, nee Golightly, who had a significant role in education herself. Timothy Hackworth was the Railway Institute's first president.
Hello, Jane.
Hello, Caroline.
So, Jane, in 1825, most railway workers in New Shildon were reporting to Timothy Hackworth. I've seen his letters, so clearly he was educated and literate. What sort of schooling did he have?
Quite interesting, looking back, researching back. His mother was Elizabeth Sanderson, and she came from the Sanderson family in Newcastle, who were very much middle-class people. I think Hackworth would have been called an artisan, but he was schooled, and indeed his father helped in the village school.
So in August, our podcast with Jonathan Ratcliffe looked at the influence of the S&DR on American railroad development, and he shared with us the perceptions of the well-educated American engineers compared to ours. And I remember him saying, Whistler was particularly disdainful of many of his uneducated British counterparts, but he was pleasantly surprised by George Stephenson, who he referred to as a common digger who took to engineering instinctively. And Hackworth, who was often discussed in the Baltimore and Ohio offices, was also positively regarded as another engineer by instinct, a blacksmith whose engineering consists in tinkering and refining locomotive engines on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. What do you think of your great-great-grandfather being called a tinkering blacksmith, Jane?
Well, I don't really like that very much. I think he was a bit more than that. He came from a family of blacksmiths, father, grandfather, etc. And obviously he worked first at Wylam, where he built, under the auspices of Thomas Waters, 3 of the 4 engines that were built there between 1811 and 1815.
So he's a specialist blacksmith with skills passed down from generation to generation. So calling him a tinkering blacksmith, a bit rude really, isn't it? The educated Nicholas Wood, on the other hand, was regarded as a gentleman whose book on railroads speaks for him as an engineer. So the Americans were much more admiring of him in some ways. So it looks like education at that time was largely class-based, with George Stephenson rejecting the low expectations of his working class by going to evening classes to learn to read and write, and with Hackworth being more towards the skilled lower middle class, or artisan, as you say, Jane, perhaps with his schooling and an apprenticeship.
And Dave, who were the first railway workers based in New Shildon, and to what extent were they educated already?
Well, I think the term educated in itself is quite an interesting one. There's the concept of a formal education, which is what we tend to think of now. But there was also the informal education by which you would learn to do a job. And in those days, your job was your reason for being, effectively. So we had people coming down to the area who had learned to do a particular job in their field, mostly in coal mining, I would say, from Yorkshire or further north. You had people like Thomas Dobson, a blacksmith, Thomas Coulson, who learned the skills around joinery, Jem Stevenson, of course, who was the first regular driver of locomotion number 1. You had people who termed engine feeders. It's an archaic term for a railway fireman. It's quite a quaint idea, the idea that, normally on the rails, the chaldrons would have been pulled by horses, and of course horses required feeding, so this idea of feeding the locomotives. And brakesmen and wagoners. So in some respect, many of those would have learnt some skills in those types of occupations elsewhere and brought them with them. The others would have picked them up as they came along. It's believed there were about 20 staff in total.
Yeah, and of course, New Shildon was growing with people moving to the area to work in collieries, quarries, foundries, all located there because of the railways.
So it's believed that by 1827, Timothy Hackworth had around 50 people employed, but that grew. New Shildon was sitting right on the boundary between 2 townships. It was the township of Shildon and East Thickley. And the boundary, if you think where Soho Street is now and what used to be Strand Street, that was the boundary between the 2 townships. So most of New Shildon sat in East Thickley. If we look at East Thickley, in 1801, the population was around about 13, and that stayed static up to 1811. That dropped slightly by 1821, which is when the Stockton and Darlington Railway was being conceived. And by 1831, that had grown to around about 35. So some of those initial employees would have been living slightly outside the township and travelling. After which we got the railway boom, the railway housing boom, I ought to say, and we see an increase by 1841 to about 452 people as a population for New Shildon. Not all of these were the railway workers. The families in those days weren't quite as large as they were as the century wore on, but there would have been children, there would have been the wives, and there were also support workers, people who came in, brick and tile workers, there would have been tailors, shoemakers, grocers, all supporting the industry in some way. And of course we start to see public houses and the erection of the first Wesleyan Methodist chapel, which was built on Chapel Street.
Yeah, okay, so all of these new arrivals, and are they all uneducated and illiterate?
Well, not all illiterate, certainly. And as for educated, as we mentioned before, education takes a variety of forms. In the mid-18th century, the Sunday school system taught basic reading, writing, as well as Bible study. And there's evidence also of private tuition taking place among the working classes. We know of at least one former member of the Institute who received private education as a young man. His Methodist parents understood the importance of that, and he went on to become an apprentice to Timothy Hackworth. We've got evidence of unskilled workers being drawn to the railway town, such as labourers, but we also see skilled men putting their existing skills to work in these new contexts, jobs like joiners, blacksmiths, coppersmiths, slaters, and also clerks were necessary to keep the railway system working. The enginemen, drivers and firemen probably had the most to learn because that was one of the newest jobs associated with the railways. They would have to learn a course about locomotives themselves, the boiler pressure, how to fire one correctly, and also the increasingly complex rules of the iron road. As time went on, that became more complex, and they would have all that to get to grips with.
It's interesting you mentioned that family that paid for private tuition being Methodist, and they'd understood the importance of education. That's one of these threads that seems to run through this. Hackworth was keen to encourage the spiritual and moral welfare of his workers, and he held chapel meetings in his house and then instigated the building of a chapel in Shildon in 1829 and another in 1831 in New Shildon with a schoolroom. And these were about providing education and spiritual guidance for the community as a whole. And Jane Hackworth seems to have played a prominent role in that. Jane laid the foundation stone for the new chapel at New Shildon, and sadly that chapel doesn't exist anymore, and then gave the address afterwards, which I think for the time must have been really quite unusual. And when the chapel was ready, she rode 40 miles to seek an able minister to open it. That chapel was next to the Globe Inn, which along with the Mason's Arms were the earliest taverns in town.
There's an interesting story about that, Caroline, which is brought to us courtesy of a gentleman named Francis Bainbridge, who was a historian in the town. And he wrote of the early years of the Institute and also of the town. And the story runs that when the Methodist chapel was first erected, right next to the Globe Inn, the proprietor of the Globe Inn, the landlord, was unimpressed at the idea of the chapel being built there and had made a hole in the gable end. And it goes beyond that. There was a certain antagonism between the publican and the Methodists. When the congregation were at worship, he would quite regularly bash on metal tins, make a racket, and could be heard singing along out of tune and shouting and bawling. So it wasn't a happy relationship between the two.
God, what a naughty landlord, honestly. So these taverns are places where workers are spending excess wages, or at least I hope the wages are excess wages. So the inns are the location of much alcohol-fuelled shenanigans.
Yes, Dave, tell us about the less well-known impact of the railways on time.
Well, I think this comes down to how well paid the drivers and the enginemen particularly were at that time. They had money to spare and would spend a lot of that money in the Globe Inn, in the public houses. And we have a story which is part of the folklore of the town and also the story of the Institute, which is that John Graham, who was a traffic manager for the Stockton Darlington Railway, one day had been passing the end of Chapel Street, which was where the Globe Inn was, and he heard this tremendous commotion. So he walked up the street to the inn, and to his absolute horror, he saw that inside the engine drivers were holding a frying pan over a fire and throwing their pocket watches in, and they were gambling on which of the pocket watches would stop first. Well, yes, this really didn't go down well. And
yes, so John Graham has an interesting education backstory too. Tell us about John Graham, Dave.
Yes, well, John was born in 1799 and was raised as an orphan and sent to work up at Hetton Colliery, which is probably as a boy trapper, one of the lowliest jobs in the colliery system. It's quite a sad existence, that of a boy trapper. And it's where the expression "not worth a light" comes from, because the young lads, they basically were controlling the airflow, the ventilation around the collieries, opening these trap doors, and they would be sat in the dark for hours on end, hence that expression about not being worth a light. And at some point he seems to have picked up an injury And that ankle injury gave him the opportunity to actually attend a day school. He was quite fortunate in that respect, despite the injury. And later on became a coal hewer, which many miners passed through that role, but rose to the post of a head underground overlooker, which is quite a strange, isn't it? How can you overlook anything being underground? But never mind. And then later, when the Stockton Darlington Railway were looking for a traffic manager, he'd applied for the job, and over 51 other applicants, he was chosen for it. So there was obviously something about him. Part of his job was to maintain order and discipline on the line, and that wasn't an easy task given that many of the rail users were private operators.
So maybe this background of self-improvement through education actually gave him a keen eye for the potential of education to improve the behaviours of the railway workers and indeed their productivity. So now we start to see some key people getting together to discuss how to better the workforce. Tell us about this first meeting and how it came about, and who was there and where was it held?
Certainly. We can be grateful to the press of the day for our understanding of what happened next and when. Both the Durham County Advertiser and the Newcastle Courant tell us that there was a meeting that took place on Thursday the 28th of November 1833. This is perhaps, ironically, in the cellar of the very same Globe Inn where the incident that inspired it took place. Present at the meeting, we know, because it was reported, that there was Timothy Hackworth, of course, John Graham, who observed the incident that led to the meeting, a gentleman called John Glass, who became quite important to the Institute as years went by, but he, at the time, was a very junior rail worker. There was John Pickering, Thomas McNair, who I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about today, and a number of other men. There were Messrs. Hallam, Atkinson, Hodgson, Stabler, Woodman, Cockshott, Elliott, Humble, and Mr. Lake.
So what was the organisation they created as a result of that meeting?
Well, we know from the history of the Institute that in the very first days it was known as the Library for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge. And what they effectively were was a group of people who would meet on a Thursday evening. We had some interesting evidence in the form of a donation from the collection of Jack Walker by Jack's son. And there's a sheet of paper which was dated 1837. And what it shows us is a list of the members, starting with Timothy Hackworth as member number 1. And it has dates. So we know that they met on a Thursday night. They would come along, they would borrow a book from the collection. And then the following Thursday, they would bring it back. It would be, the number of the book would be crossed off and they could borrow another book. So that was how it all started out.
So do we know what sort of books they had?
We do. There was quite a wide range of books, but the book lists are still kept at the National Archives in Kew. There weren't that many devoted purely to science or engineering, as you might expect. There were a lot of inspiring biographies of well-known people. There were some fictional works. There was a lot on English history, books on morality, biblical matters, some poetry and literature, and a lot of accounts of global travel. So the objective seemed to have been really to broaden people's outlook, to broaden their minds, but also to get the reading practice in. If they were reading about things that interested them, it brought that skill up.
Right, so did other towns have similar libraries at the time, or was this something quite unusual?
It's quite an unusual thing. Books were, on the whole, quite expensive, not really within the reach of ordinary people. And most places didn't get public libraries not until at least the 1850s, and even then they were few and far between and heavily dependent on philanthropists setting up that kind of facility. So at this time, libraries such as they were closed libraries and you had to be a member. There wasn't a public library scheme like there is today, perhaps.
So where was this library for the promotion of useful knowledge?
It was originally in the Methodist schoolroom, which was partly why they were only able to meet on a Thursday evening, because the building was being used for other purposes the rest of the time. And then in 1842, they had the opportunity to move into the Mason's Arms, which had been vacated for other purposes. And that is when it became a more regular reading room facility.
So the Mason's Arms was vacated because
of the opening of the tunnel under Shildon.
And so presumably at that point, the S&DR created another station on the line that was now being used to go into the Prince of Wales Tunnel. And that's why the Mason's Arms room became free.
Yes, exactly.
Right, okay.
And at this time, who's actually running the library?
Well, the most important figure I think, was member number one, Timothy Hackworth, who was its very first president. He was obviously quite influential in gaining the support of Joseph Pease to be a patron. And having a patron for an organisation like that was very important, because the books would have to be either paid for through the subscriptions of the members or the support of a kindly philanthropist. So Joseph Pease was right there behind it. And the secretary, probably as important as the president, was a gentleman called Thomas McNair.
So they're all educated men. If we have a quick look at each of them. Jane, your great-great-grandfather was the first president. You've already told us about Timothy's own education, but do you know what his views were on education and those of his wife? Just views on education more widely.
Yes, they believed totally that both girls and boys should be educated, which was really marvellous. In fact, the girls all did quite well, and actually Prudence, one of the daughters, ended up running her own school in Penrith. And Jane, the youngest daughter from whom I am descended, was actually sent to Brussels to a Roman Catholic school, which is quite interesting as they were Methodist, to learn French and to further her education.
Did they get a lot of criticism for sending a daughter to a Catholic school when they are Methodist?
Yes, I think the Church of England was bad enough, but I think the Roman Catholic faith was completely out the door. But it is interesting, actually, that talking on education, that in those days, if you weren't a member of the Church of England, if you were a Roman Catholic, a Methodist, a Baptist, or a Quaker, you could not go to university. That is why so many of those people who went in to help build the railways were actually quite wealthy people.
They'd rather been forced down the business route, hadn't they, without going to university?
Also, Jane was very keen for her daughters to learn all skills, crocheting, needlework, etc. And they were taught music. The family had a piano in their home, and their house had many books. They read Byron and Sir Walter Scott. And the girls all kept albums for sketching, photographs, writing.
All right, so you can see why certainly Timothy Hackworth is a good choice for the president of this institute, because clearly, you know, they profoundly believe in the importance of education. So that makes a lot of sense. So Joseph Pease, you mentioned him being the patron. Obviously, he's from a wealthy Quaker family, would have had a good education. And again, the Quakers tend to believe in education for everyone, men and girls and boys, I should say. I read an account of him visiting a Quaker girls' school at Newington Academy at Stoke Newington in 1827. And that school taught girls proper academic subjects like the maths and sciences. But it's probably better known for being the first school to have a school bus. Dave, is Joseph Pease on record as having particular local sympathies with getting the working classes educated?
Well, I think the key with Joseph Pease is that he was a member of Parliament at the time. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he was one of the first Quaker members of Parliament, and was able to become so only due to a change in the oath that MPs take when they become a parliamentarian.
I guess Quakers won't take an oath, will they? And don't take their hats off either. And you had to take your hat off in Parliament.
That's absolutely right. And one of his parliamentary peers was Lord Brougham, who was a fellow Whig. This Pease, of course, was a Liberal at the time. Now, Brougham had an interest in education himself, and in 1826 had been one of the founders of a society which was actually called the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge. So straight away, you can see that there's a similarity between what the library at Shildon was called and this society. Now, the Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, their mission was to produce affordable books for working people. So I think there's this connection through which perhaps some of those types of books were included in the library to be offered out to the workers in Shildon. I think that's where the connection with Pease comes from.
Oh, interesting. So that brings us to Thomas McNair, the secretary, another interesting person. Tell us all about him, Dave.
Well, Thomas was born in 1810 at Wallsend, and as a very young boy was engaged, this was in 1819, to work at Hawthorne & Co.'s, which were a locomotive company that had a works in Newcastle. With that kind of experience, by 1831, he'd been engaged by Colonel Stobart and Joseph Pease, who we were just talking about, to work at the Shildon Works. This was initially as a storeman, but over time he became a draftsman. And while he was at Shildon, he invested time himself personally in developing the Sunday school there. When the library was founded, he became the secretary there, keeping the records of the memberships and the lending and the acquisitions of books. And having made an impression for the kind of skills and qualities that he had, the Stockton and Darlington Railway moved him to a post at Darlington in 1838. And by 1849, he'd been appointed as the secretary to the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which is quite an important post for the company, of course. In 1858, I think he carried that idea of the institute and the library in Shildon, and he founded a new one in Darlington and immediately became its president and spoke both the institutes during that period. I think he created such an impression that a street was actually named for him, which is currently the street just outside Hopetown in Darlington. So obviously an influential character.
Did you notice that the street in Darlington actually spells his name incorrectly, which is quite annoying and would have upset an educated person?
It's true, but I've seen different spellings of his name in various places, so it seems to have been a common malaise, shall we say?
The trouble with Mac surnames, isn't it?
Yeah. So was this new library popular, Dave? Who, for example, if anyone used it?
Well, we're quite fortunate. As I say, we've got that record that we obtained through the donation of the Jack Walker collection. And one of the items there was that sheet of paper that I mentioned earlier from 1837, which lists 25 of the members at the time. So that enables us to find out a little bit about them. Some of them we haven't been able to trace any records of. We don't know who they all were. But we know that we have people, of course, like Timothy Hackworth, Thomas McNair. But then you have William Stabler, who was an engineman. So, he's clearly managing to attract the people that he was targeting with this organisation. Had James Richardson, who was a blacksmith. William Pease, joiner. But not just railway people. There was, for example, Thomas Cree, who was a shoemaker. So whether Thomas had joined with an intention of getting in with the railway people and perhaps moving to a job for Hackworth, or whether he was just interested in the opportunities that the books and the learning would give him, is an interesting point.
Yeah, so given Jane's explanation earlier on as well, that Jane and Timothy both believe that education should be accessible to all. You've mentioned a wide range of occupations there, Dave, but were women also allowed to use the library?
All the named members in the early days, as far as we can see, were men. Although the report books, and we do have copies of the report books going back to the 1850s, and I think there are older ones in the National Archives at Kew, do tell us that women were involved in the Institute, more in the sense of the events. In later years, when they had the penny readings, which was the idea for people who couldn't read themselves, they could come along and for a penny somebody would sit and read them the news of the day. I think women were welcome to attend those sessions as well, from what I can see.
That's interesting. Audiobooks.
Yeah, a very early form of audiobook.
I think Timothy would have encouraged these, and he very much wanted his daughters to have full education. But, of course, remember, they could borrow a book. The men could borrow a book and take it home, and then their wives or children could actually have access to it.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Jane. I wanted to add as well that as time went on, we do know from the membership books that women did earn the right to become full members of the Institute. We had several listed female members, one of whom was Elizabeth Allen, the wife of George Allen, the Shildon-born brass band composer. And we also know that the magazines and periodicals that the Institute subscribed to as years went by started to include publications like the Women's Suffrage Journal. So it wasn't exclusively a men's organisation right the way through its history.
Is there a point that you can actually draw to that where you start seeing more influence from women or more women members? Is there a point that's turning? Is it 1840s, 50s, 1880s, 1920s?
It's a fuzzy boundary, but I think we start to see it from the 1870s and 1880s onward. I have no evidence of a point where a decision was made to allow lady members, but we do know that it happened.
So going back to the 1830s, 1840s, the Library for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge starts to change. It seems to go through a process of slightly altering its functions, altering its names. builds up a relationship with Mechanics Institute. Can you talk us through that and whether it's about adopting its format to make it maybe a better fit for a wider audience, or what's going on?
I think it's a natural process of evolution, and this is continuing even today. So in the 191 years that the organisation's been going, it's either changed its name or its nature 7 times now, and the latest being just last year when we became a community benefit society rather than an incorporated association. And it really is a natural evolution. So, for example, when the organisation started holding lectures and classes, it couldn't really call itself a library, and it had acquired a reading room. They were buying in magazines and periodicals. So that was an evolution. I think the affiliation with the Mechanics Institute organisation was probably to gain an advantage of some sort. There were other discussions that we know among the committee members over time as to whether to join other unions of types of organisation. But you don't really need to take my word for the fact that it's been a continuous society right the way through. So if you look at the period where it becomes a Mechanics Institute, which coincides with its moving into the reading room at the Mason's Arms, several of the founders of the library, so people that were named at the very first meeting and had responsibilities with the library, became presidents of the Institute in its Mechanics Institute era. So people like John Hallam, Francis Cockshott, John Pickering, and of course John Glass, who was the longest serving president for the Institute. Francis Bainbridge, as I mentioned before, created a centenary history book of the Institute in 1833. So it was acknowledged then that it was a continuation of what started, 1933. It's a continuation of what started in 1833. And then you get that next stage, that next evolutionary phase, which is the conversion to being called a railway institute for the first time based on Redwith Road. Now that's really down to the North Eastern Railway. The North Eastern Railway started its own scheme and built several what it was calling railway institutes prior to creating the building on Redwith Road at Shildon. So what it was doing there really was it was bringing the organisation at Shildon into line with its other, I suppose, clubs or organisations around the region. So that's where the name change came in. The North Eastern Railway wanted to call it a Railway Institute to align with what was going on at Gateshead, at York, and up in Newcastle.
So remind us again when that happened. What was the date of that?
That was in 1913,
right?
Which is a bit of a trick question, Archie, because it does say 1911 over the door. What had happened was in 1906, the building that Stockton and Darlington Railway had created for the Institute on Station Street had started to become a little bit unsuitable. The organisation had petitioned the North Eastern Railway to build them a new building. And as I mentioned, they'd done that in other towns already, so it seemed a reasonable petition to raise. The North Eastern Railway did relent and intended to build and open it in 1911, but 1911 was the year of the first great national rail strike. And the workers at Darlington and at Shildon particularly, how can I say, misbehaved, should we say. They didn't behave very well at all. And when the rest of the country came off strike, Darlington and Shildon continued. And I think as a result, the opening of the new institute building was delayed by 2 years to 1913.
Right.
So we often get people thinking that it's 1911, but it was actually built, completed and opened in 1913.
Was the foundation stone laid in 1911?
I'm not sure, Jane. I'm not sure.
Right.
We don't have a history of the construction phases.
It's a lesson though, isn't it? Just because something's written in stone, it doesn't make it true.
True. That's true. But just to sort of continue very briefly, in 1933, we may come to this, but the London and North Eastern Railway, who had absorbed the North Eastern Railway into its operations, installed a plaque at the Institute acknowledging the 100 years between 1833 and 1933. So they were quite convinced that it was a continuous organisation as well. And in 1938, just slightly on from that, when Irene Topham was crowned the only railway queen to have come from Shildon, she was sent on her, they did a little bit of a mission abroad. Each railway queen went abroad. And Irene Topham went to Sweden in 1938. And when she went, she took a special wreath that had been made to place at the statue of John Ericsson, the Swedish locomotive designer. And the wreath had the wording, as a symbol of our esteem, from the oldest railway institute in the world. So that idea of the continuity, it's not a modern idea. It's carried on right through the history of the institute, the story of the institute, and it's being perpetuated by people who would know. They would know if it had stopped and become something different.
If I can pull us back a little to the 19th century and the earlier days of the Railway Institute in its varied forms, by the 1830s, who's actually 1830s, 1840s, who's giving the talks?
A combination of people. So some of the talks were given by local people connected with the railways. For example, in 1848, Francis Pickersgill-Cockshott, who was a member at the Institute, gave a talk on Teesdale and the lead mines. But you also got travelling speakers, so people who would be travelling the country, and if there were opportunities to engage them to give a talk at Shildon, the Institute would do that. Quite often there were clergymen as well, so not necessarily speaking on religious matters. It might be, well, I'll call out some of the titles of lectures that were given. Overland to India, Poem on the Village.
What on the village?
Poem on the Village.
Thought you said something else.
No. But then more technical subjects, pneumatics with experiment. You'd get a selection from the Pickwick Papers or Dickens' Shooting Party. So quite a selection of different titles for lectures.
Is there ever anything organised for children?
It's a very good question, and I don't think there was necessarily. I think that was possibly because the Stockton Darlington Railway had already opened the British School in Shildon, so the provision for children was more through the British School. However, there are items in the report books of the Institute that suggest that younger men, probably teenagers, were allowed into the reading rooms, and there was quite often dismay at the fact that newspapers would be torn up or thrown around, spoiled by the younger visitors. So I don't think they were excluded.
How much are people paying to access all of this?
If I remember rightly, it's around about 4 shillings a quarter. So quite affordable, but it was still a decision that people had to make. Were they going to invest in membership of the Institute or go to the pub?
So had the selection of publications available increased by now?
Yes, the Institute used to allow the members to play a part in deciding which magazines and newspapers to subscribe to. And I would say very much as today, a lot of the newspapers that were coming out, it's not like you could acquire them at a newsagent or a corner shop. You had to have them delivered by post to your home, and it was quite an expensive affair, hence why it worked out better for the community, for the Institute to bring them into the reading room. But a lot of those publications had an agenda. So there were left-leaning or liberal-leaning, shall we say. There were Tory-leaning papers. There were papers that were focused on Christianity and morality. So I think this process of having the members being able to select which ones they wanted to read allowed for that diversity of views, really. I think, there was something for everyone.
I think you mentioned earlier on when we were just chatting a little bit about the role of women within education, that a variety of different activities beginning to happen as well. So what other kind of activities did the Institute do by now?
There were excursions. So there are some grand stories of some of the early excursions. Of course, as you would expect, they would be by rail. So excursions to the coast, to places like Whitby, Saltburn, which was effectively established by the Stockton and Darlington Railway as a holiday and excursion destination. I think the very first excursion they had to Whitby, I believe the line didn't extend all the way to Whitby. So what they had to do was catch the train to Middlesbrough, and they were put on a boat from Middlesbrough down to Whitby. And that boat had taken insufficient ballast on board. And I understand from the report at the time, it was a very uncomfortable journey by sea with the boat rocking about, and there were several complaints afterwards. There was an incident of an excursion as well where there was a collision. I can't remember the exact date of it, but one of the trains, the excursion trains rather, the driver had seen an oncoming train and had believed that it could get to the points before the other and hadn't. And there was a collision, and several of the excursion party were injured in the collision. There were also complaints about the quality of I was going to say carriages, but they were more open trucks pretty much with seats that were provided. They were deemed to be uncomfortable, and complaints were raised about that. There were also celebratory teas. So certain milestones were celebrated. What would happen, because round about that time, even the reading room at the Mason's Arms wasn't large enough to host a celebratory tea. So they would take a building on at the works. And of course, traditionally, the ladies would take care of the catering, the tea, the coffee, and the shed would be decorated. There would be branches, there would be diagrams of locomotives, there were heraldic shields of the local families, the Surtees family, for example, and musicians. And they had these grand teas to celebrate. And quite often members of the Pease family would come and speak and talk of their pride of what was going on with the railway and at Shildon.
So Jane, back in the 1830s and 1840s, do we have any evidence of Jane Hackworth getting involved in these activities?
Not specifically, except as I did say, she was a Methodist preacher, so she did go out on horseback and do that sort of thing, and also encouraged her daughters, but there's no actual written evidence that she took part in anything in the Institute.
Right, I suppose one might speculate that she probably did, simply because she was such an active member of the community, and certainly, according to Robert Young, took quite an interest in the railway families themselves.
Yes, and she probably, like most women, she probably brought food down to the Institute.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I know.
And who cleaned the Institute, I would like to know.
So, at what point did they leave the Masons' Arms, and why? And who paid for new premises, and where are they?
Well, it's a classic case of campaigning. You could call it pester power, really. What was happening was, because the organisation was attracting new members through its increasing collection of books and the kind of publications, the penny readings that they did at the reading room, they needed more space. They were constrained by space. So they'd petitioned to the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company to provide them with a dedicated building. And in time, the directors of the railway company, having been quite sympathetic to it anyway, with Joseph Pease being the original patron, they did build a new dedicated building for them. And that was opened in 1860 on Station Street in Shildon. Some of the older residents around the town might remember that building as the Isoldo Cinema, but it was opened as a dedicated building for the Institute. And we do know, Jane, who the person who cleaned the Institute was at that point in time.
Well done.
It was a chap called Jeremiah Bulch, and he conveniently lived in the house next door to that new Institute Hall.
So last month we looked at S&DR celebrations. When they moved into this new building, were there any celebration?
Oh, of course. Of course. There's always a celebration involved. Yes, cake and tea and plenty of coffee. It was such a well-attended opening that they couldn't fit everybody in, even to the new hall. And there were people crowded outside waiting for their opportunity to get in and have a look around. And as always, there were speeches involved just on the past, the past of the organisation leading up to this point and the prospects for the future.
And with larger premises, were they able to expand their offer to the members?
Yes, they were. It gave them quite a few opportunities, to be honest. So having their own premises also meant that they could hire it out to other people, to other organisations, and that gave them a revenue stream as well, which was money that they could invest back into, such as books and other facilities. So we start to see leisure coming into this now. One of the smaller rooms in the new building was reserved for playing drafts. So there was a lovely table with a drafts board already inlaid in the top.
That was the drafty room.
The drafty room, it was. And given that the Stockton and Darlington Railway were very generously renting the new building to them for only £1 a year, they really could put a lot of that income back into the organisation. That was a real opportunity.
So I wonder if the larger premises, more activities taking place, this is one of the triggers that actually encourages more women to get involved at this point. Just, you were talking earlier, the number of women get involved gradually increases over time. I just wonder if that's sort of the 1860s is one of those.
I think you're right. And I think the sort of activities that we start seeing reported as taking place there, for example, choral societies. So choral societies were more of a mixed activity in the community. And concerts as well. So when you start to have concerts, people come along as couples It's definitely the beginning of a more social involvement with the women, and I think that leads to lady membership.
So the building actually doesn't last that long. It starts to show signs of decay by about 1900, which for an old building seems quite a short life, really, doesn't it? What sort of problems was it having, and what was their cunning plan?
Well, curiously, I think you'd be right now in saying that about a building, but the structural problems with the new building occurred much sooner. Within a few years, they were starting to see a few problems, and they had to get the railway company to engage contractors to come and make corrections to the building. They also expanded it in 1884. They bought the house next door, which is still standing today, and effectively knocked a corridor between the two. And that was really just to accommodate more members. But you're absolutely right. By 1906, the problems are so severe that the building's deemed to be unsafe, and they have to cease hiring it out to other organisations. I think the library collection is still kept there, but it really becomes imperative to find something more suitable.
And that takes us back up to the story about 1911.
Exactly. That takes us to what we were talking about in 1911.
Okay, so at that point they move into the building we were talking about earlier, which says 1911 over the door, but it's actually from 1913. For people who don't know the building, Dave, can you describe it? Because it's exceptionally grand.
I think it is. And we mentioned that the North Eastern Railway that arranged for it to be built that last of all the railway institutes that they built, or railway institute buildings rather. But it's certainly the grandest, and I think they acknowledged that on the opening day and the opening speeches. It was designed by William Bell, who was the principal architect for the North Eastern Railway, and built by a chap called Earnshaw, who was from Darlington. So his family firm did the construction work. And architecturally, it's in the Baroque Revival style, which is quite impressive in itself. And I think it tells you something if you were to compare it with the North Eastern Railway's headquarters building at Stuperdale in Darlington. The architectural styling is very similar. And of course, with that being a headquarters, that was deliberately intended to be impressive. It was big as well. I mean, the main hall absolutely had capacity for around about 486 people. You now had the library room, you had the reading room, which is currently a bar. You had a billiard room because billiards had started to come into fashion, and a lot of the men wanted to get together to play billiards. There was not a bathhouse, but like a bathing room with slipper bath, so the men could go after work, pay a small amount, and have a nice, comfortable bath with hot running water. It really was quite plush for the time. And of course, right at the top, the very top of the building, there was a caretaker's accommodation. So for the first time, it has a resident caretaker who's there all the time, and they've got this flat right at the top there. And when you go in, you can see it would have been quite grand at the time. There are still some original features from back when it was built, although it's very much dilapidated nowadays.
I noticed when I was looking at the list of rooms that it had a ladies' reading room, so there does seem to be a formal place now.
Well, ladies' magazine room.
Oh, is that what it is?
Yes.
Oh dear.
Well, you're right. It's a room that's reserved exclusively for the ladies.
And so we have to get back to ceremonies again. Was there a ceremony for opening this building in 1913? And was there cake?
There was indeed. There was also a silver key, which we have photographs of at the Institute today. So the opening took place in February, and the chief engineer for the North Eastern Railway, a gentleman called Vincent Raven, who was later knighted, was there to present the key to Sir Arthur Pease, who was the latest member of the Pease family to support the Institute. So Arthur Pease had the honour of opening the main doors and letting everybody in. And again, everybody gathered in the hall, and the hall had been decked out with all the portraits of all the well-known industrial people. Timothy Hackworth himself, of course, as the first president. And on the very back wall behind the stage where Arthur Pease stood to give his opening speech were the portraits of the members of the Pease family who'd supported the Institute through the years as well. And he commented that in his speech.
I'm interested in the doors, because I've been down there before, and I think there used to be some kind of mechanised element to them, wasn't there?
It's been said, but I've not found the evidence to support that. I don't doubt it, because one of the gentlemen who's told us about that has quite a long association with the Institute. But if that were the case, I think any evidence that of that mechanism has been removed since.
Oh, right.
So where's the silver key now that opened the doors?
I'm told it's still in the possession of the Pease family. We spoke to Matthew Pease, and I think he told us that he believes it's still a treasured possession in the family. But we do have photographs on site, so we know what it looked like, and it explains on the. I'm not sure of the structural names of parts of a key, but at the top it explains the event that the key was particularly made for.
They have to get that key back for a visit in 2033. Yeah. So obviously it's opened in 1913, First World War. How did that affect the running of the Stute, if at all?
I don't think it particularly affected the running of the Stute, but it certainly affected the membership. Several of the members at the time, obviously being young men, many of whom were rail workers, but not all. There's evidence of teachers and grocers as well also being members of the Institute at that time. But of course, a lot of them enlist very early in the war, particularly those that had been attending the ambulance classes. They were brought into the Royal Army Medical Corps, so an awful lot of Shildon men went into that. And it takes its toll. 30 young members of the Institute lost their lives in First World War, and another 200 or so that we know of served, 4 of whom were members and were nurses. So there's a memorial at the Institute now, which names not just 30 fallen, but the other members of the Institute that served, and it names these 4 nurses. We looked into their respective stories, and that was really quite interesting. But again, evidence that women are very much part of the Institute movement by that point.
Last episode, we spoke about celebrations within the S&DR. So in 1933, the Stute itself would have been 100 years old. I presume celebrations were part of this? Was it marked in any kind of way?
I thought you were going to ask me if there was cake.
I know, I was waiting on him to say that. He never mentioned cake, and I thought, would it be rude to interject and say cake?
Yeah, there was absolutely celebrations. And I think, as I mentioned at another point, there was a celebratory plaque created by the London North Eastern Railway, which is still mounted on the wall, marking the first 100 years. But they went further than that, and this I find absolutely fascinating, which is that they held an exhibition of locomotives and rolling stock at Shildon, rather not on the same scale, but rather like what happened in 1975 for the Stockton and Darlington 150th anniversary. And among the locomotives on display, there were a couple that were, how can we say, rock stars of the locomotive world. There was the locomotive 10,000, which was called the Hush Hush, which was a massive engine. It turned out to be not particularly successful in engineering, but it was a real talking point. And there was also a locomotive there called Aerolite, which is currently at Locomotion. So it's nice to see that connection's there. But Aerolite was an older locomotive from the 1890s, I believe, that at that time was being used personally by the chief mechanical engineer of the railway company to visit different departments and depots and works around the region. So it's nice to see that back in the town. But, quite a treat. And I think it would be difficult to imagine something like that happening in 10 years' time, should we say, when we reach our bicentenary. But it's just a mark of how the LNER appreciated the significance of not just the Institute, but I think the whole educational movement that was connected to the railway industry.
Yeah, so we're at 1933 centenary. By that stage, is its role still educational, or has it become more of a place of entertainment?
No, it's still very much in the educational space by that point. It still has its library of, a few thousand volumes, still a reading room. I think that drift towards being a more social venue starts to take place around about the 1950s. We've got documents in our archive that explain about the conversions that were made to the building to accommodate a bar, a conversion to the cellar to allow draft beer to be put down. There were other changes as well, attempted changes to the heating system and what have you. But I think things started to go that way in the 1950s.
Sort of post-war reaction, is it? They're much more interested in...
I think partly a post-war reaction, but I think also an acknowledgement of the kind of things that were becoming available to the wider public after the wars as well. I think there were social movements to try and improve the lot of working people. And I think you started to see things like public libraries being run, across the county. So perhaps some of the facilities that are traditionally offered weren't as exclusive as they used to be.
Yeah, so that's the kind of development of the 20th century, I guess, up until the 1980s.
So with the government of the time in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, they closed the railway works in 1984 in Shildon with devastating consequences for the local community. How did that affect the Stute then? Because everyone's losing their jobs and there's no money around.
They are. And we know from photographic and video evidence that meetings were held. The workers campaigning to try to keep the works open held their meetings at the Institute. So the locations that we can see in the photographs, we recognise from the building today. And surprisingly, it hasn't changed that much. But ultimately, that campaign to keep the works open was doomed to failure. I think the government and British Rail had its strategy well worked out in advance, and the works did close. At that point, the Institute was part of, and this was this evolutionary phase. As far as British Rail were concerned, it couldn't be its own thing. They'd integrated it into British Rail Staff Association. So it was part of British Rail Staff Association Eastern Region. Still a continuation, but it had been amalgamated again into this wider organisation. And of course, ultimately, British Rail Staff Association was ceasing to exist as British Rail was privatised, and they were divesting themselves of properties, including the Institute and the associated sports ground in Shildon. So ultimately, a decision was made for the Institute to go its own way again, as it was right at the very beginning. And the British Rail very generously agreed to sell the building to the membership for £1.
Who would have been using the Institute at this time then, given the Army of Railway Workers have all disappeared?
They haven't exactly disappeared. It's interesting that you say that, because you're right. When the works closed, a lot of them did drift to other towns around the country where the works were staying open longer, so Eastleigh, Doncaster. But there was still an awful lot of former railway workers here. And the membership in, shall we say, 1989, several works after the works had closed, would be pretty much the same as the membership in 1980 before the works closed. It's just that they no longer consider themselves employed by the railway companies. So there's long-standing family traditions. And even now, if you're to come in there when some of the older members are together, they can still tell you of their time at the works. There is a continuation. But of course, it's not about the railway company anymore. And that's, I think, sometimes where the Institute struggled to find its place in the world and for people to gravitate towards it. Working at the railway is no longer a reason to join the Institute. So who does?
I'd love just to say that even before 75, the wonderful portraits had gone from the Stute. Yeah. Because my father and I, when we came up to start doing work in 72 to try to save Hackworth's house, we were told that the pictures had gone and they didn't know where they had been taken to. Well, we've had a bit of fun on that, haven't we, David, of Dave finding out where some of them have got. We've got a replica of the portrait of Hackworth back, and we believe that there are others. So that is really great. But we just couldn't find out where they had gone, and some of them have definitely gone to the National Railway Museum, for which we have to do some more work.
It's very true. It's very true. But a challenge like this, I think a couple of researchers like ourselves, Jane, we love this kind of challenge, don't we? I personally think that the portraits left in the 1960s, and I suspect it's round about the same time as the Timothy Hackworth blast pipe letter, because we have a letter written to the then Secretary of the Institute acknowledging that the Institute had donated the Timothy Hackworth blast pipe letter, the letter from Stevenson, to the Durham County Archives. And it's kind of acknowledging receipt of it and saying that, if we ever want to loan it or anything like that, we just need to contact them. So I have a feeling that in the 1960s was when they looked around and thought, wow, what's all this old stuff doing here? We should really clear it out and
by the
smarten
time we
person.
came up in 72, certainly the portrait had gone.
Yeah, and looking back at all of that research back then, you're talking about the 1960s, Dave, but being a bit of a whippersnapper yourself, obviously. When did you get involved in the Stute? And as you say, given that the membership doesn't really require railway workers any longer, what future do you see for it?
Well, full disclosure, I am not a Shildonian. I moved to town in, let me get this right, it would be 2000, I think. And my next door neighbour was a member at the Institute, and you move into a house, you get to know the neighbours. He said, "Come down to the Railway Institute. I need to introduce you to people, and you need to see what it's all about." And I went along. This would be possibly around about 2002. I didn't become a member until 2018, which is quite late. And then in 2019, a different gentleman in the town said, "Dave, I need to tell you, I've heard that the Railway Institute might close. This is terrible. We need to do something about this." And I agreed, I'll be honest. We had a little chat about it, and we had a public meeting. We'd gone down to speak to the committee at the time and asked their permission to try and help. We had a public meeting, brought people along, and it was true. They were losing about £1,000 a month. Their reserves were being eaten away, and it looked as though within a year it would be closed. And just the idea of such a sad termination to this legacy of Timothy Hackworth and Thomas McNair and Joseph Pease, it was unbearable. And I think people saw that. So there was a rallying point round about 2019, and we started a little organisation to work alongside the Institute and help out and look back a little bit to see what we could learn, because I think by that point, the Institute had forgotten to do that. It was living very much in the present. It saw itself as a social club. It was looking around, seeing social clubs across the country failing as people's habits changed. And it was panicking. And I think we just had to take that moment for reflection and think about, what could we do about this? And it's still a struggle now with a building, over 110 years old already, that was built for a time when coal was in cheap supply. And with a connection to the railway industry, they could get it even cheaper. You could heat a building of that size, and the scale of it was, the sustainability just wasn't an issue. I think in modern times, that's not the case. So first of all, we want to try to look at the building and keep its qualities. We have to keep those qualities because that's the heritage aspect, but there must be ways to make it more sustainable. So we're looking at partnering with other organisations to explore that. But we also need to find a way forward for the town whereby the Institute can fulfil what the town needs now rather than what it needed in 1984 or 1957. And that's something the Institute's always done. At the very beginning, it was about books because ordinary people could rarely afford the luxury of books. In 1913, it was billiard tables because billiard tables are quite expensive, but the men at the time wanted to play billiards. What is it in 2025? We're exploring that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking here about education in this particular podcast, and I think that's something that you're beginning to resurrect a little bit at the Institute as well, isn't it? That kind of idea of having like a library there. I
think so, yes. And we were very fortunate. We had a space at the Institute that wasn't being used at all, that was perfect to serve as a kind of library. And an opportunity arose whereby the friends of the head of steam, Darlington Railway Museum, had some books that they wanted to divest. We had a small collection ourselves, and we thought, why don't we use this room as a library? It's got shelves in already. We got a team of volunteers from my workplace. I work for BT, well, specifically EE, the mobile network, and they were looking for opportunities to volunteer in the community. So we got a little squad of people to clean up the room, repaint it. We fixed up the shelves. We got some new furniture, and we reintroduced a library. Now, that might seem a mad thing to do in the present day, because I think there's a perception that all the knowledge that's there to be had is just a click away on the internet. But actually, when you think about it and you're sort of looking for information, the internet usually scratches the surface. There's an awful lot of accumulated knowledge in these books. And some of the books that we've got go back to the 1860s, the 1870s, right through to the 1930s, the 1970s. And some of them are practically brand new. But as time's gone on, we're acquiring more of these through donations. And they're all on the subject of the railways, of local history and characters, local industry. So it's a nice little wealth of knowledge, and even if it's, you know, rarely accessed, it's there for people. We're just finding ways to. But I don't think it'll be our main offering. I think what that is it's a tip of the hat to our origins, to the traditions of the institute and those needs. But it'll be there for people. I think looking forward, it would be nice to look at educational work of other types, you know, whether that is looking at basic life skills for people, or whether it's getting older people to get to grips with technology, a kind of social education rather than formal. I don't think we can compete with colleges, but we need to talk to our community about whether the need for that is there. And that's something we're doing at the moment.
I think it's very, very important with the banks closing and people having to go online to do it, that we do help elderly people become more and more computer literate. Because everything, you know, if you see anything on television, it very rarely gives a telephone number. It just gives something, you know, an email address, which is very hard. I think that would be wonderful. The other thing I'd love you to do is to form a 5s and 3s team. Have you got one yet?
I'm sure it's something we can do, Jane.
Oh, it's a great game.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because obviously next year is the Railway Bicentenary, the Stockton Darlington Bicentenary. And the Institute has always played a part somewhere in the celebrations. How can we say it? It's always been the bridesmaid and never the bride. I don't think it's ever been the focus, but it's always come up with an imaginative way to celebrate, whether that's a grand tea party as we did in 1850 or 1875 or some of the things that we've done since. And one of the things that we've got in mind for next year is a games tournament. And we're going to team up with the BR Sports and Social Club. And over 2 days, we're going to have a festival of sports and games, really. So there'll be the football, the cricket, there'll be the outdoor bowls. And then we're going to go into the indoor games. You know, you might expect pool and darts, but also things like 5s and 3s, chess, a chess tournament for younger people, maybe even esports as well, you know, get the younger people involved in that. So I think we can work on getting a 5s and 3s team together. Yes, if you want us to come over to Barnard Castle and challenge you, Jane.
I'm sorry to hear that none of those plans for next year involve cake.
There will be cake. I can assure you there will be cake. Yes.
So just as we sort of finish looking at the Stute, if we take those first 20, 30 years of it existing, has anybody tried to quantify the impact in educational attainment because it was there? Can we start to see the education of railway workers in terms of literacy increasing? Has anyone tried to look at that? Is it even possible?
I don't think it's ever been attempted, and it is an interesting question. What we do have, I think, is anecdotal evidence, shall we say. So there are certain people who came to prominence in their field who cited afterwards the influence of being part of the Institute as young men. So among them, we've got Daniel Adamson, the younger, who, of course, really made his name after his time working with Timothy Hackworth as a boilermaker and also a champion of the Manchester Ship Canal. Yeah. And when he came back to the Institute in the 1870s, he gave a speech and he spoke of the importance of having that opportunity as a young man. There was Francis Pickersgill-Cockshott that we mentioned, who went on to be locomotive superintendent of several railway companies, initially up in Scotland and then down in the southwest. He was a locomotive superintendent there. We have William Denton. William was born in Darlington. He was a Darlingtonian, but came to work with Hackworth as an apprentice. He acquired a love of geology, and in the excavation of the Prince of Wales Tunnel, he was finding fossils. He, again, became a member of the Institute, and in a biography of him that was published in the 1870s, after he'd moved to America and become a professor of geology, he cited the importance of the opportunity to go to the Institute, not just for the books, but he's on record as having said that the debates were useful to him. So I think, you know, there was an element of debate at that time too. So that anecdotal evidence is there that certain individuals took that opportunity and grasped it and you know, made something of themselves using that as a tool along the way. But I don't think it's ever been quantified. I think it's a good question.
But education works the other way too, doesn't it? I mean, look what Shildon gave to the world with the visits from French engineers, American, German, Prussian, and of course Timothy built the first locomotive for Russia, the first successful locomotive for Russia. Although he built it, but it was actually designed by Robert Stephenson and Co. And that's what they did. A lot of them were designed by one and then built by another, which was very, very good. And I think you think all these engineers came to learn from what Shildon could offer. The men may not be able to read and write, but my goodness, they had good mechanical knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely right. Good problem-solving skills and innovations as well. There were quite a few innovations, particularly in the field of the creation of rolling stock that came out of the Shildon works, just by regular workmen who were probably unacknowledged for the creation. It just became the property of their ideas, became the intellectual property of the companies they were working for.
It's one of the amazing things about the S&DR was it was really open source information at the time that was freely given to anybody else who was interested in how to run a railway. There was no question of hiding that information from them in a competitive way. It was all about sharing, wasn't it? So thank you both very much for sharing your expertise in the education of railway workers. Clearly working for Hackworth virtually guaranteed you a job anywhere in the world. And the creation of this stute created opportunities for self-improvement, for men at least in the early days. Good luck, Dave, with moving the stute into the next phase of life. And I look forward to cake in 2025.
Stars of the S&DR.
Well, as we have Jane Hackworth-Young with us today, we are, of course, going to feature her great-great-grandfather, Timothy Hackworth, the S&DR's first mechanical engineer. Tell us a little bit about Timothy's younger days at Wylam, Jane.
Timothy was born at Wylam in 1786. His father was John Hackworth, who was foreman of the Smiths. He unfortunately died in 1804. Timothy had begun his apprenticeship in 1800, and it was a 10-year apprenticeship. So it wasn't until 1810 that he was actually on full-time employment at Christopher Blackett's colliery at Wylam. In the interim, somebody had been appointed to stand instead of John Hackworth as foreman of the Smiths. But Christopher Blackett promised Hackworth that once he finished his apprenticeship, he would take over his father's position, which was absolutely marvellous. Eventually, they started to build the first of the Wylam locos, which is no more, unfortunately. And John Wesley Hackworth, Timothy's son, says in his letters that when it was supposed to go forward, it went backwards. And when it was supposed to reverse, it went forward. But for all that, it was very successful. This was followed by a locomotive that most people would have heard of, the Puffing Billy, and then the Wylam Dilly. But the Wylam Dilly was being built in 1815, and Timothy was prevailed upon to work on the Sabbath, and as he had become a strict Methodist, he felt unable to do that. So he left Wylam in 1815, but became foreman of the Smiths at Walbottle in 1816. But he left behind in Wylam his brother Thomas, who was 11 years younger than he, and who had just started his apprenticeship. And so poor old Thomas had to keep his head down. Their mother was also living in Wylam. So he had 6 years, actually, after his father died as apprentice. He became a Methodist, and through the Methodists, he met his future wife, Jane Golightly. She had had a rather extraordinary and unfortunate background. She was fairly middle class, but her mother died when she was quite young, and her father remarried. Her father then died, and her stepmother remarried. And in the end, the stepmother and father actually threw Jane and her brother Anthony out of the house. And that was when Jane became a Methodist, and that's when she met Timothy. Wylam Church was built later, so they were married in the Church of England Church at Ovingsham, which is only 2 miles from Wylam. So that's how really they met. They had 3 sons and 6 daughters. John Wesley Hackworth was the eldest and became a very, very famous engineer. The second 2 children were twins, and little Thomas died 6 weeks after birth, and Mrs. Hackworth was very ill indeed. Timothy, the younger one, named after his father, actually went on to run Soho Works after his father's death, but they were trying to sell Soho Works. His mother died, and he developed diabetes, and of course insulin was not known as any kind of medical help for tuberculosis in those days. So the 6 daughters were all educated. The eldest daughter married a man called Samuel Holmes, who actually went out to America and did a tremendous amount of work there on locomotion and worked towards the 1893 Chicago exhibition, which was to have replicas of Hackworth's locomotive, because they believed that Hackworth was the man behind the locomotive. So that was fine. That was then 2 elder daughters. Anne, she married, but she ended up in an asylum. We don't know whether she miscarried or whether she had anything like that happen to her, but it was very sad. The second daughter, Mary, went out as a governess. She too ended up in a lunatic asylum. And my father did quite a lot of research on this, and arsenic was used intensively in the works. And he believed that they might have been affected, particularly as John Wesley Hackworth's wife also ended up in a lunatic asylum. And they were all in this terrible situation of things like arsenic and other things being used. So then there was Prudence, who's the 4th daughter. She ran the school at Penrith. Then there was Hannah, who had special educational needs, as we would say now, but she lived with her family and then with Prudence until her death. Prudence looked after her. She was amazing, Prudence. She very much tried to get recognition for her father, and it was a really hard fight. And the youngest daughter was Jane, and she was sent to Brussels to be finished just after her father's death in 1850.
Can you just tell us a little bit about John Wesley? Because you mentioned earlier in this recording about his trip to Russia. And from what I know of, this is an absolutely extraordinary story. So I think we should share it with everyone.
Well, John Wesley Hackworth grew up really learning from his father, everything his father was doing, and really became a very capable engineer. Robert Stephenson got the contract to build 4 locos for Russia, but he knew he was not able to actually build 4 at one time. So knowing Timothy Hackworth very well, he prevailed upon Timothy Hackworth to build the 3rd loco, and actually the 4th was built by someone else as well. And Timothy Hackworth built the loco, but it was to Robert Stephenson's design. And this is the thing of one of them designing and one building, and this happened so many times. Anyway, Timothy was too busy to go to Russia. He was superintendent engineer of the Stockton and Darlington Railway and his own works, and his brother, Thomas, who was actually managing his own works, not able to go. Why was he not able to go? He was getting married. So Timothy said his young son would have to go. So the locomotive had been tried out in the Soho Works in 1835, and then it was dismantled, packed in crates, and was going to be sent out to the Baltic. On the way to get the boat, John Wesley Hackworth, with his father, Timothy, had a real step back because the coach lost a wheel, and so they missed the boat to go to the Baltic. Anyway, eventually young John Wesley, 16 years old, got on the boat and arrived in the Baltic. But the Baltic ports were all frozen up. And it was only by putting the crates containing the locomotive onto sledges, pulled by both horses and dogs, that they managed to get away and then escape wolves who came out, actually do some terrible harm to them. Eventually, poor John Wesley Hackworth reached St. Petersburg. The railway was from St. Petersburg to the Tsar's palace at Aracelo, which is only about 3 miles away. And when he was putting the locomotive together and trying it out, a cylinder blew. Now, this is quite an interesting thing because actually a cylinder blew when Hackworth entered his sans-pareil for the Rainhill trials in 1829. So it was a very inexact science. And who in Russia or where could you go to get a cylinder board? Well, The man, George Thompson, who was working with John Wesley, said the only place that will be able to do it is the armory in Moscow. The armory in Moscow is about 600 miles from St. Petersburg. I've done the journey in the snow up to the gunnels. It was amazing, in a loco, which is an amazing experience. Anyway, John Wesley got the cylinder back and refitted it to the locomotive, and it was tried out before the Tsar, who proclaimed that it would only be used on holidays and high days and religious days. John Wesley Hackworth was very shocked. Being a Methodist, the Russian Orthodox priests came down and sprinkled the locomotive with holy water, and he was truly shocked. But in fact, his father was even more shocked, because when he arrived back in 1837, he was sporting an most amazing beard. Now, this was 1837. Victorian men, that was when Victoria came to the throne, of course, didn't have beards and whiskers until the end of the century. So he was a bit like a punk rocker. So that is the story of just John Wesley's Russian train, as we call it.
Jane, did you ever feel like becoming an engineer?
You know, I would have loved to have done it, but I don't think I have that makeup. And, you know, I was born in 1948. I was going to say 1848 or 1746 or something, but I was born in 1948 and I'm now 76. Well, at that time, it was strange enough, really, for many girls to go to university. And certainly no females did seem at that time to go into engineering. There was always the odd one who had. But I would have liked to have done. My father tried to teach me a bit later. I do understand how a steam locomotive works. And I do understand about the blast pipe, but I'm not going to tell you now.
So can we, so shall we look at his journey, in that case, towards becoming the S&DR's first mechanical engineer? How did the S&DR hear about him?
Well, it was, in those days, in the Northeast, everyone who was a blacksmith, which were the forerunners of engineers, knew each other. And George Stephenson was born in Wylam, as was Timothy. And although he moved very soon down the Tyne, he kept in touch with Wylam and he saw what was happening in the construction of locomotives there.
When did Timothy Hackworth start working for the S&DR?
Well, that was what happened. In the end of 1824, he went back. He was a borrowed man from Allbottle to take up his post again. But he'd left his brother Thomas there, who was doing so well, that he decided that there was not really room for both of them. And anyway, he had got his taste again for building locos because of his contribution to locomotion. And so he wanted to set up his own works. He was then offered to be a joint shareholder in George Stephenson and Co., but he refused that and thought he would set up work on his own right. So Timothy Hackworth then was approached by the trustees and he took up his post as superintendent engineer of the Stockton and Darlington Railway in May 1825. And of course, the railway opened, as we all know, on the 27th of September 1825. So that was how it all began. And he was in charge of all the locomotives and rolling stock. He got the contract in 1833 to run the whole of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So he went on and he set up in 1833 also his own works, putting his brother again, Thomas, in charge. So when we actually talk about the locomotive for Russia, Thomas and Timothy built her, Robert's sign, and they built the three first engines for Nova Scotia in 1838. So that's how it all started. Meanwhile, Timothy was left at Shildon and he had to choose between running his own company, which in 1840 he changed its name to Soho Works, or remain as superintendent engineer of the S&DR, and he decided on the former. So he was now able to build locos for himself and for the company. So a house was provided for Hackworth when he first moved to Shildon. Originally, he'd had a house in Darlington and then for a short time a house in Brusselton. And in fact, Caroline found the letter saying that Timothy Hackworth was leaving and Jem Stephenson, who was George Stephenson's brother, who swore like a trooper, was going to take up residence in Brustleton. So the Stockton and Darlington Railway built 3 terraces in what we call New Shildon, which is where the railway is and was. And the 3 to 4 houses in the terrace were the first buildings in that part of Shildon. And Timothy Hackworth took up residence there.
That was 1826.
In 1826, yes. In 1825, he couldn't bring his wife down for quite a long time because she'd been given birth to the twins, Timothy and Thomas, and little Thomas had died.
It's interesting, though, that the family probably doesn't actually move down until he takes up residence in Brustleton in the engineman's house in 1825, and then they'll all move together to New Shildon. Of course, the house that everyone visits now, which is Hackworth's house, part of Locomotion, actually doesn't move until much later, does it?
1831. The Stockton and Darlington Railway built a house for him. And it has 2 front doors, and it probably didn't originally. But in 1833, Thomas brought his wife down, and they lived in each side of Soho House or Cottage, as it was called. And so that was 1831, and Thomas left in 1839.
So just going back to, obviously he started working, as you said, in May 1825 for the S&DR, which isn't too far before the 27th of September. So what was his role on the opening day?
Well, actually, on the opening day, he acted as guard, marshalling the crowds more than anything else.
And after the opening day, what were his main challenges?
Well, then he had to he took on, as they came from the 4th Street Works, the 3 subsequent locomotives, all of which were unsatisfactory. And so he then said in 1827 to the directors, "Can I build a locomotive to prove the supremacy of steam power over horses?" And he used the boiler of a defunct engine called Chitterprat, and the Royal George was born, and it could pull the weights, whatever the weights of coal or anything else, at half the cost of using horses. So it was totally successful. And it was there, 25, the engineers from abroad came over to see him, but from 27, a lot, and they write it up about, what they're seeing and what they're taking back to their countries with them. I mean, one American says that there's no doubt that the only way we can build our locomotives is to follow the designs at Shildon.
I think that's one of the roles that Hackworth had that's maybe not appreciated quite so much, because everyone concentrates on how he adapts and improves the locomotive. But this business of spending a huge amount of time with engineers from all over the world sharing that knowledge has to be one of the main reasons why the S&DR got the world on track.
Yes, and also, although Thomas Story was the civil engineer, Robert Stephenson had designed the engine houses at Brustleton and Etherley. Black Boy came later, with stationary engines, and he'd only put down the plans, Robert, and then of course he had gone abroad. And so Timothy was given the task to make those stationary engines work. And one of the incredible things he did was, because you are pulling up from one side, which is longer than the other side, which is steeper, he actually put in drums of different diameters, so you could have a different rope on the diameters to go up and down. So that was very successful. And, of course, his youngest daughter married the engineman of Brustleton's son. So it all ties in.
Whose surname was?
Young.
Exactly, which is why you're sitting here with Hackworth-Young. Earlier on, you've already given us a quick run-through of Hackworth's career trajectory with the S&DR, how he went on to set up his own business, eventually calling it the Soho Works. Did that actually turn out to be a good move for Hackworth, or would he have been better staying as an employee?
I think things were moving. I've been reading certain transcripts in the last few days. It seems that Timothy had got the contract of running the whole railway, but the directors were sort of wanting to take it back under their umbrella. And I think Hackworth thought, because he had built locos for abroad and went on to building many locos for Wales, as did his brother Thomas, he thought he perhaps would be better as his own master. But it wasn't easy, because 1840 was really the beginning of railway mania. And you had all sorts of engineers trying all sorts of things. And he was just this very small enterprise. And he got the order in the mid-40s for 14 locos for the London and Brighton Railway. It then became the London, Brighton and South Coast Railway the following year. And he was really overstretched. And a chimney fell down on his erecting shop and very badly damaged. So he was put behind with the ordering. John Gray was the engineers down in Brighton, and he kept changing the plans and changing the plans and changing the plans. And in the end, he was sacked. And then Kirtley was employed, who didn't get on with Hackworth, and he died 11 months later. And then Hackworth got Craven, who went on to be a very great engineer, and he actually ended up building 12 of the 14 locomotives for the London, Brighton, South Coast Railway. But it was hard work, and his son by the end had gone and set up his own works, John Wesley Hackworth. And he had his son Thomas, and obviously he had other men who worked for him in his works. But it was becoming harder and harder.
So after Hackworth's death, was his business sold on to anyone else?
For the first couple of years, his son, Timothy, tried to keep the works going, but then became ill. And they went on and on trying to sell it, and actually Prudence moved the whole family out of Soho because they thought they had a sale. Anyway, in the end, in 1855, it was bought by the Stockton and Darlington Railway Company. And Jane, of course, died in 1852. She and her husband, she and Timothy, are both buried in St. John's Churchyard, quite a nice obelisk, with their younger son, Timothy, who died in 1856. And after the business was sold on, I think the staff was so well trained that the Stockton and Darlington Railway would have taken most of them on. When I've been looking through people who worked on the S&DR, that seems to be what happened. And they had been so well instructed by Hackworth, and they were growing. They were growing and growing, so they needed more engineers.
So, Dave, did the Stewart mark his death in any way?
I don't know. There's a reason I don't know, which is the answer is in the books that are at Kew. And when I was there, I forgot to look at that bit. So I took photographs of member lists and things like that. The book that we've got starts at 1855, which would be 5 years too late. So I don't know. I know exactly the reference number of the book that will have that in.
So in fact, life may have been quite difficult towards the end, but he still left a fine legacy. His contribution to mechanical engineering is perhaps less well known than George and Robert Stephenson's, because he stayed in Shildon with his loyal workforce and their families, whereas the Stephensons spread their knowledge and skills far and wide. The Northern Evening Express of June the 2nd, 1881, wrote something rather nice about Timothy Hackworth, which we'll just finish and I'll read it out. To Timothy Hackworth belongs the honour of establishing Shildon Works as a school for the education of many of the most eminent engineers in the profession. Their names could be gleaned in every quarter of the globe where railways exist, and include those of Thomas McNay, John Graham, Dan Adamson, and his son, Denton Edgar Gilkes, several members of Parliament, agents in many branches, and workmen of the highest class of different vocations in the United Kingdom. To have been in the employment of Timothy Hackworth at Shildon 40 years ago was equal to a Masonic password of acceptance, as it was a century ago in the time of Boulton and Watt at Birmingham.
Tales from the Rails, steaming ahead to 2025.
So, what's this month's news?
It is coming up to the time when our beautiful new Arty limited edition coffee table book will be going to the designers. That means it's your last chance to be listed at the front as a subscriber.
So if you'd like to pre-order this book and become a subscriber, then go to the Friends website at www.sdr1825.org.uk and all should be clear from there. And remember to tell us how you'd like to be referred to in the list of subscribers. A reminder about the SDR 200 Research on the Rails competition. This is being organised by the Cleveland and Teesside Local History Society and the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway for original research into the S&DR. The best entries will be published in their journals, The Globe and Cleveland History, or we might decide to publish a separate new joint publication. The original research can be on any subject connected to the history of the Stockton and Darlington Railway up to 1863, including its impact beyond that date. It can be about people, technology, events, archival research, impacts. The choice is yours, to be honest.
The prize will be up to £1,000, provided jointly by Cleveland and Teesside Local History Society and the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and awarded to the author or authors of an essay which fulfills the criteria of the competition and which, in the opinion of the judges, merits the award.
On that note, the next Globe, which is the biannual journal of the Friends, is due out in December. I'd like to receive contributions by the 28th of November to give me plenty of time to produce it, so it's ready for you to read over Christmas. The Globe can only be as good as the contributions, so please do what you can to pass on content.
And there's another competition too. The cleverly named Right on Track, that's with a W, is a creative writing workshop. We're looking for poetry, short stories and memoir pieces related in some way to trains and railways. These don't have to be specifically about the Stockton and Darlington Railway. We just want to see a clear link to railways, tracks and trains within the work. You can find out more at the Tracks Darlington website, which is tracksdarlington.co.uk.
And there is in fact yet another poetry competition commemorating 200 years of rail. This is called the Railway 200 Poetry and Prose Project and is being run by the Watercress Line in Hampshire. Everyone will be able to submit 2 pieces, which will then be included in an anthology of works next May. A copy of the anthology will be available to view on the Watercress Line website later in 2025. All works submitted will be included within the collection. The works have to be your own work and a maximum of 1 side of A4 and can be any type of poetry.
The closing date for works is 25th February 2025. Works can be any type of poetry, but must be inspired by the Railway 200 anniversary and themes on the Railway 200 timeline, and must be emailed to education@watercressline.co.uk for inclusion.
I've submitted one already, but I'll spare you. I won't read it out to you. A huge thank you to Husqvarna, who handed us a cheque for £2,500 to cover the costs of our next walks booklet due to be revived, and that's going to be the Darlington Circular, and I've started work on that now. If you're a member of the Friends or a member of staff at Husqvarna, you'll receive an invite to join a Walking the Line event soon between Hopetown and Edward Peasy's house on North Road.
The Friends held training for walk leaders at Locomotion on the 14th of October. The purpose of this is to make sure that all our walk leaders provide a walk to a high professional standard. We intend organising a walking festival in 2025 and hope to combine this with beer and books, or possibly baking. Does that mean cakes?
Cake, definitely.
It will be advertised as part of the S&DR Fringe events next year.
Story Homes have just presented a cheque for £15,000 to the Friends of the S&DR at Fighting Cocks. This is part of the planning process where planning permission was given to Story Homes for a residential development, and it was conditional on a number of things happening, one of which was to provide an enhanced level of interpretation at Fighting Cocks on the S&DR. And indeed, so what they've done is they've asked the Friends to deal with that and have handed over the £15,000 cheque to cover that. So that's great news.
Yeah. You might remember that we mentioned the rescue and conservation of part of Edward Pease's house in Darlington in previous podcasts. There has been some progress, and the planning and listed building consent applications are now in.
Hooray! And I've saved the best news for last. The Friends have been awarded a grant of £238,788 by the National Lottery Heritage Fund.
Yay!
Yay! To take forward our project for conservation and care of the S&DR post-2025. This money is key to appointing our own full-time development officer for 18 months, more days a week paid for our secretary, Jonathan, and the development of a business plan and a conservation plan, all of which will help to secure a long-term legacy after 2025. This is so important. After the celebrations in 1975, when the dust settled and the cake had been scoffed, nothing really happened to protect the remains of the railway, and quite a bit was destroyed. This money will help the Friends set themselves up for a more secure financial and sustainable future that will continue to care for the line, run events and activities, but also hopefully take on the role of a buildings preservation trust that restores S&DR buildings and structures, finds new uses for them where appropriate, and then makes income out of them to invest in the next conservation project. So if you haven't already joined and you've got some skills we're going to need, get onto our website, join up and make yourself known. There are exciting times ahead.
Tales from the Rails. This podcast was brought to you by the charity, the Friends of Stockton and Darlington Railway. Visit our website at www.sdr1825.org.uk.
That's it for another month. Thank you for listening. Hopefully you're all now feeling well and truly educated. You can buy Dave Reynolds' book at The Stute if you happen to be in Shildon, or on Amazon if you're anywhere else in the world. If you want to know more about Hackworth, you can still get copies of Timothy Hackworth and the Locomotive by Robert Young. It remains the most authoritative book on Hackworth and was written originally in 1923. It's been reprinted since. The one still in circulation, I think they're the 1975 edition. Is that right, Jane?
No, 2000.
Oh, 2000. I'm working for an older copy then. You can get that from the Friends website, but there aren't a huge number left, are there, Jane?
Only about 50.
Oh, well then. Yeah, if you want one, get it soon.
There is also a book by Mike Norman called It Wasn't Rocket Science. This is fiction, but heavily informed by accurate research into the life of Hackworth. You can also buy that from the Friends website. Thanks to Dave Reynolds for sharing his knowledge and passion on The Stute, and as always, for our theme music. We've really appreciated you taking the time off to join us.
And thank you too to Jane Hackworth-Young for sharing her knowledge about her great-great-grandparents.
Next time, we will be looking at the development of the railway station on the S&DR.
So until next time, it's goodbye from Dave Reynolds.
Goodbye.
Goodbye from Jane Hackworth-Young.
Goodbye.
And goodbye from me, Caroline Hardy.
And me, Archie Mackay.